you didn't have to throw your brain in the dustbin to be a Christian, that actually there was an incredible intellectual tradition in Christianity.
God's story, your life. Unfolding short stories.
Why are you still a Christian? It's the question Justin Brierly asked himself, and it's pretty close to the title of his new book, Why I'm Still a Christian. After encountering God as a teen, he found himself later in Oxford, surrounded by skepticism. What he discovered? You don't have to throw your brain away in the dustbin to believe.
I was born into a Christian family. Growing up in the UK, it's quite a secular environment. There aren't that many churches. So being a Christian kind of makes you stand out from the crowd somewhat. And I had plenty of secular, skeptical friends around me to keep me on my toes. But I had an experience in my teenage years that I just couldn't deny. It was an experience of God at a youth camp where suddenly the reality of God just came alive for me. I was kind of blasted by the Holy Spirit. And from that moment on, from the age of 15, I just knew there was a God. I knew he loved me. I wanted to read the Bible. I wanted to pray. I had one of those kind of road to Damascus moments where things just came alive for me. So I had this amazing experience of coming to know God through Jesus in that moment as a teenager. But a few years later, I found myself at Oxford University, where I was a student, an undergraduate studying politics, philosophy, and economics. And I found myself surrounded once again by people who were very skeptical about the Christian faith. Very few of the people I knew at my university were Christians, and lots of them were quite skeptical about Christianity. And so I ended up having a lot of conversations and being challenged very frequently about my faith by the people I was around at university. It kind of had a difficult effect on me. There was at least one term when I was in that kind of undergraduate phase where I questioned everything. Maybe it was all in my mind. Maybe these people are true. There's no God. There's nothing out there beyond, the firings of our brain synapses and the chemicals and the DNA that makes us up. So I began to look for answers. And you know what? I found there were really good answers, it turned out. Because actually one of the people who had been at Oxford University 80 plus years before I had was a guy called C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is probably one of the best known Christian writers, thinkers of the 20th century. Many people know him for his Narnia books, but he was also a brilliant thinker. And he himself had a story of coming from atheism as a young man to becoming convinced that there was a God for philosophical, historical reasons. There's a famous story of him having a walk around Magdalen College Gardens with J.R.R. Tolkien, who was one of his contemporaries. And he was discussing whether it made sense to believe that Jesus was really the Son of God. And J.R.R. Tolkien said, well, what if this is the one true myth? You love all those stories, C.S. Lewis, about the ancient gods and the pagan stories and so on. But what if there was one story that really is true, that all of those are just dim echoes of? And that convinced Lewis that actually he had found the true expression of God in Jesus Christ. And I suppose I went on a similar journey, realizing that actually you didn't have to throw your brain in the dustbin to be a Christian, that actually there was an incredible intellectual tradition in Christianity. Alongside C.S. Lewis, I started bumping into all kinds of modern Christian thinkers like William Lane Craig, a well-known American philosopher who's done some amazing debates with Christians and atheists all over the world. In fact, as I progressed in my career after university, I began to explore this whole area of what's technically called Christian apologetics, the rational defense of the faith. I loved theatre as a young man. I wanted to do something that communicated, and so I moved into radio. I ended up presenting a radio show called Unbelievable for 17 and a half years, in which I brought together Christians and atheists to debate the big questions. Is there evidence for God? Can we make sense of the Bible? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? And I discovered in the process that there are really good reasons to believe in Christianity. I realized, in fact, that we all come to life with a worldview. A lot of people are under the impression that if you're a Christian, you have to provide all of the evidence and all of the argument to make someone believe that there is a God and that Jesus is his son. My atheist and skeptical friends also have a worldview. And when they came on the show, I was going to ask them questions about how they made sense of what they believe. Because most of the people who came on, who called themselves atheists, they believed that the universe essentially came from nowhere and was heading nowhere. There was no overarching purpose to life. And that raises all kinds of questions. How do you make sense of the fact we're here? I mean, why is the universe ordered in such a way as to allow human life in the cosmos? And what do we make of things like truth, beauty, justice, love? Can those really just be boiled down to chemical reactions in our brain? That didn't seem like the best way of looking at those questions to me. I realized that there are just as many questions that I need to have for my atheist friends as they should rightly have for me as a Christian. The question is, when we both look at the evidence that's available to us, whose story of reality makes the most sense? And I became increasingly convinced in hosting these conversations between atheists and Christians that actually Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually. It makes an awful lot of sense of things like, why do humans exist in the first place? When you look at the extraordinary complexity of the universe and the way in which it had to be set up in order for life to even be possible, that doesn't look like it makes sense on a purely naturalistic, atheistic worldview where it's all down to chance. It looks as though we were meant to be here. There's a grand designer behind the whole thing. So I thought, human existence, that seems to point towards rather than away from God. And then I looked at the question of human value. Rather than looking out there at the universe, looking within and asking, why do we believe in human rights? Why do we believe in dignity? Why do we believe that every human has equal worth? If we're just one more random outcome of a unguided process of evolution, then we have no particular right to say we're more special than anyone else. But actually, if we're all made in the image of God, then that kind of makes sense of that intrinsic belief most of us have, that humans do have this intrinsic worth and value and dignity. It makes sense of the fact that we create whole documents of human rights. Again, human value seems to point towards rather than away from God. And finally, I thought about human purpose. What's the point of life? Why are we here? Again, the atheist story of reality is one in which there is no ultimate purpose. One day, the universe will be extinguished in terms of its usable energy. We're running out of a story to make sense of anything on the atheist worldview. That didn't make sense to me as a Christian. I believe that actually when I look at the universe, I see hope, I see truth, I see purpose in all kinds of ways. And the person I think who gives us the greatest hope is Jesus Christ. That story of reality in which there is a God and he came to be with us in person and he gave his life for us so that we could experience true life with him. That made more sense to me than the purposeless story of reality that I found on atheism. So when I look at human existence, human value, human purpose, all of those seem to point towards rather than away from God. Now, I've met many really intelligent atheists, and I always want to have good conversations with them. I don't want to dismiss them. But when I look at the story of reality that we're both invested in, it seems to me that God is a better explanation of things than a purely material, non-physical, random, chaotic almost story of reality on atheism. In the course of hosting these conversations, I ended up writing this book, Why I'm Still a Christian, in which I've tried to give some of the reasons why we can believe and why we can make sense of faith, and also to answer some of the key objections. I experienced many of those questions as I hosted these conversations, not least the question of the problem of suffering and evil. If there is a good God, why does he allow so much suffering and evil in the world? It's a great question. There are no easy answers to those kinds of questions. But in the end, I find that you've got two choices. Either suffering and evil is a mystery that we have to accept and trust in God for, or it's simply meaningless. That's the problem. On an atheistic worldview, there isn't a good answer to the problem of suffering and evil either. It's just completely meaningless. It's just whatever happens, hard luck. I'd rather believe actually in a universe where even if I don't have all the answers, I can trust in a God who does have the ultimate answers. And a God who actually came in person to experience pain and suffering with us, who on the cross knew what it is to suffer. And that may be the best answer someone can have when they're in the midst of suffering to know that God knows how they're feeling, because God came to be one of us.
Justin's journey didn't just shape his faith, it shaped his friendships too. One of them is Peter Byram. Now they work together. But years ago, Peter was sure God was nothing more than a well-constructed delusion. And yet, the very questions that unraveled his faith eventually led him somewhere unexpected.
I've encountered many people who have been on a similar journey to me. Very often, they are Christians who perhaps were shaken in their faith or lost their faith altogether because they ran into some of the so-called new atheists and their books. Richard Dawkins is a well-known atheist in the UK, and his best-selling book, The God Delusion, in the mid-2000s, was part of a movement known as New Atheism, trying to persuade people to abandon their beliefs. Well, I actually give thanks to God for Richard Dawkins, because he has prompted so many interesting conversations about faith since writing that book. And I actually know people, believe it or not, who have become Christians because they read that book, ironically. It was precisely because he was raising these questions that it made them go away and actually investigate. One of them is a good friend of mine called Peter Byram. Now, he was raised in a Christian family, but he had kind of lost his Christian faith by the time he went to university. He read Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and he thought, that's it, I don't need to believe in God. It's all a fairy tale. End of story. But then, Peter was confronted by two housemates, one of whom was a very devout atheist, but one of whom became a very radical Christian during his time at university, and he found he couldn't escape the God question as easily as he'd hoped. So he decided, maybe I ought to go and start watching some YouTube videos to see what this is all about. And so he went and watched some of those videos by the atheists, and he found them quite convincing. But he heard them referring to one or two Christian thinkers, so he thought, well, I might as well go and see what the Christian thinkers are saying about this as well. And so he started to watch people like William Lane Craig and Professor John Lennox, an Oxford professor of mathematics and science, Christian thinkers making the case for why it might make sense to believe in God. And he suddenly ran into arguments he'd never really heard before. Arguments from science and philosophy and history, arguments that questioned atheism, and arguments that seemed to make actually better sense of the God hypothesis. He suddenly found himself conflicted. Maybe I'd dismissed God too easily. Maybe I'd only really read one side of the argument. He went on a journey over several years that brought him into my path. He started listening to my show, listening to these conversations between atheists and Christians. He even helped to arrange a debate and speaking tour with William Lane Craig in the UK. He ended up becoming good friends with William Lane Craig. And it was on that tour in 2011 that he finally made the decision to become a Christian. He realized he'd been intellectually persuaded by the case for God and Christianity. He just needed to take the emotional step, the heart step of actually putting his trust in Jesus Christ. And he did it during that tour. I today work with Peter. He's a very close colleague of mine as we continue to host conversations and create podcasts, books, media and events, helping others to explore faith and to find a thinking faith for themselves. And I've seen hundreds more people go on that journey. It's evidence that you don't have to throw your brain in the trash can to be a Christian. Christianity has always been about the head and the heart. Yes, we certainly need to believe things with our heart. It's good to have experiences that remind us there's a God and that he speaks to us in all kinds of ways. But let's not abandon the head either, because Jesus told us to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, and mind. We've been given a mind, and actually when we use it, we find that the fingerprints of God are all over our universe and within us as well. I believe it makes perfect sense to be a Christian, and we can be confident in our faith. And we can go out and have confident conversations with people who maybe don't share our faith. That's okay, because in the scriptures, we're told to always be ready to give a reason, an answer to anyone who asks you about the reason for the hope that we have, but to do it with gentleness and respect. So that's my story, and I hope it's helped you.
Justin brought atheists and Christians to the same table, not to win arguments, but to search for truth. Through Unbelievable, his debate radio show, and now his book, Justin's story and work remind us you don't have to throw your brain in the dustbin to be a Christian. Books on apologetics help us to firm up our faith. They encourage us to use our mind to worship God. A part of my own story has to do with books like Mere Christianity from C.S. Lewis and The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and how they helped me make sense of and led me to a firm belief in truth claims of the Bible. A few weeks ago, I was at the library and I saw Justin's book in the news section. I checked it out, I'm enjoying it, and I like how Justin uses stories to tell you about his journey with apologetics. As the book title says, Why I'm Still a Christian. If you're interested in the book, there's a link in the show notes. The Unfolding is a faith podcast. You can discover more at myfaithpodcasts.com.